Hello friends, my name is Ajay, one of the TAs for Comp 423, and welcome to the first video on the Comp 423 YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the Angular front-end framework. As you know, Comp 423 is a course all about the foundations of software engineering. And throughout this course, you're going to be working on many full-stack software engineering projects, all of which are going to be using Angular. Now, an assignment has already gone out, which is the official Angular Getting Started tutorial written by Google. One of the key skills that this course aims to emphasize is the ability to read technical documentation and learn new tools through this documentation. So before watching these videos, I highly recommend that you give the official Angular Getting Started tutorial a try. However, this video is going to be kind of hopefully making you feel a little bit more comfortable about Angular and talk about how Angular projects are structured. This video will be split into two parts. And the first part, we're just going to be talking about the basics of Angular. And then the second part, we're going to be adding on new Angular tools to our toolbox. So let's get started. All right, so what is Angular? We already talked about Angular being this front-end framework, but what does that mean, right? So Angular is a front-end framework written in the TypeScript programming language, right? And so TypeScript is the language that you have already begun to start getting familiar with, at least through the reading. And the first few lectures of Comp 423 will really emphasize teaching you TypeScript. All right, so what is Angular? We already talked about Angular being a front-end framework, but what does that mean? So first, Angular is a front-end framework written in the TypeScript programming language. You all have probably heard of TypeScript by this point, as TypeScript is the main front-end language that we will be using in this class, and you may have already begun to get a little familiar with TypeScript through the first reading as well as through some of the course lectures. However, Angular is a framework, which means that it is a toolkit that is added on to the base programming language that allows us to do something. In this case, allows us to build single-view web applications, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. Now, one of the key things that we talk about in this course is the full stack, right? This is a full stack software engineering course. So what does that mean? Well, ultimately, such programs, web applications like the CSXL site, as well as the ones you'll be building in your projects, are broken up into two main parts. And throughout the entire course, we'll be emphasizing this and we'll be building on this model. However, we have the front end, or the client side, and then the back end and the server side, right? And so the front end is essentially all of the pages that you see when you load up your browser. For example, if you go to apple.com or csxl.unc.edu and you see a page show up, that is the front end. That is the client side. It is what the user actually sees when they open a web page. However, that is not all in an application. There is this second part called the back end, or the server side, which manages the data within the application and the internal logic. And both of these pieces are constantly communicating with each other. Now, Angular is a front-end framework, which means that we're simply going to be focusing on the front-end side throughout this part of the course. Eventually, once you build your front-end toolbox, we will begin to move towards the back end. But for now, it's important to get familiar with all of the tooling in the front end. And so our focus is going to be on this, right? And so the second thing that we talked about is that Angular is used to make single-page web applications or single-view web applications, right? Now, what does this mean? Well, I want to show you the official CSXL webpage in its current state as of the recording of this video. And the CSXL site is an Angular application. This is live currently at csxl.unc.edu. And as you can see right now, we are on the Organizations tab. I pressed on Organizations on the left-hand side on my toolbar, and it brought me to this URL, the csxl.unc.edu/organizations. And this is showing all of my organization data. Now, on the left-hand side, I have a toolbar with many different options, right? And so each of these options are associated with their own view or a screen that we essentially see, right? So for example, my organizations view is at the csxl.unc.edu/organizations URL. However, the co-working view is at the co-working URL, events has its own URL, etc. And so a single page web application is essentially an application that is made up of a collection of these views. However, we have one page, and whenever we navigate to a new URL, our page dynamically changes to the view that we want to show, right? So for example, I'm here currently on my organizations view, but if I press on the events button on my tab, it's going to essentially it's going to rewrite my page, and my page is going to change so that we show the events view. Angular allows us to create this system using something called the app routing module. Right? And this is essentially how our Angular application is set up. We have what we call our views are actually in Angular known as components. So components are how we implement views in Angular. And I'm going to be showing this as an example in a second. So for example, if we go back, right, we have this co-working, events, organizations, academics, and about views, and we implement these views in Angular using components. So the co-working view will be essentially implemented using the co-working component, events component, organizations component, and so on. And then each of these components have a route that is going to be associated with them. For example, we again have the csxl.unc.edu/coworking route, we have the events route, organizations route, and these are all pointing to these components. Then we have this tool called the Angular App Routing Module. And the app routing module is responsible for showing the correct component based on the URL that the user navigates to. So for example, when I go to the CSXL page and I press on the organizations button on the toolbar, the app routing module is going to see that. It's going to say, okay, this is the organization's URL, so therefore I need to show the organization's view, which is of course implemented using the organization's component. Okay? So now this might be a little bit confusing at first, but now we're going to go and jump into an actual Angular project, and I'm going to show you how all of these things are implemented. All right, everyone, I am now inside of Visual Studio Code, and I have a sample Angular application open. If you're interested, I think I will have this particular file in GitHub in the description below in this video, so you can feel free to play around with this as well. The structure of this is just slightly different than EX0. However, it's more similar to the actual CSXL web application that you all will be working with starting in the next exercise. Okay? So if you notice here, this is our folder file structure that we have. We have this .angular file, which is generated, and this contains a whole bunch of Angular tools. We also have a .dev container folder, which allows us to essentially create what's known as a dev container. There's a great reading on dev containers, which will be linked in the description below, written by Noah, one of our TAs. And dev container allows us to essentially pre-install and have this what's known as a container or an environment with all of the tools that we need to have installed already. So this is really good for when you're collaborating with other people, and you might be working with one person who's on a Windows, one person on a Mac, and dev containers essentially allow us to keep all of the versions of all of the different tools that we're using the same across these different computers. So this .dev container folder is going to contain all of the information relating to that. Then we have node modules, and node modules are essentially all of these different tools and extra TypeScript code that allows us to make our Angular project work. We'll be talking about modules or node modules further down in the course. And then we have this source file. And source is really where, and I can make this a little bit bigger, source is where all of our Angular components and the app routing module and all of that actually is stored. So I'm going to open up my source folder, and then we also have we have a few other folders below. We have an app folder, assets, index.html, and etc. But we're going to go into this app folder. And what you'll find here is that we then have these folders here for event, home, navigation, and organizations. And actually, these are our components. And I'm going to open up, for example, the organizations folder, and you'll see that there are 3 files. We have organizations.component.css, organizations.component.html, and organizations.component.ts, right? These are 3 files that all share the same like a starting name, so the same prefix, if you will, organizations.component, organization.component, organization.component. And so these three files are all related to the organization component. And remember, we said that components are how we implement views in Angular. So our organization view is implemented by this organization's component. And so there are three files here. And the first one I'm going to open is going to be this TypeScript file. And so I'm going to make this a little bit smaller here so that you can see the code. And there isn't too much here. However, you'll notice, and especially if you read the getting started with TypeScript or TypeScript 101, or getting started with TypeScript reading, this might begin to look slightly familiar. But essentially what we're doing here is we're creating a class, a TypeScript class called organizations component. And you can see it has an empty constructor. We have this weird thing called route, which I'll be talking about in a second. And then above it, we actually have this, what's known as a decorator. So we have this @component decorator. And this decorator, as you can see, is imported from Angular. So when we add this decorator onto our class, this is the component decorator. It's basically specifying that this class right here is now an Angular component, okay? And there are three pieces to my decorator. I have the selector, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's not too important for the time being. Template URL and style URLs. And you can see that my template URL is linking to my organizations component.html file, which is right here. It's in the same folder. And my HTML file, as you can see, contains some HTML for my organization's page. In my TypeScript file, again, if we go back, we have style URLs, which is a list of files. In this case, or an array of files. In this case, we're only storing one of these, which is my main CSS file for my organization's component. Now, you have probably heard of HTML and CSS files at this point in the CS major. However, if you haven't, HTML is essentially how we define the structure of a web page, right? What elements should be on the web page? For example, if there needs to be text or headers or images or links, that is all in the HTML. And then we have a style sheet or a CSS file, which allows us to stylize the elements that we put on our page. For example, this may be changing font colors, changing background colors, changing alignment, etc. So I have my HTML file, and then I have a CSS file as well. Now, these are linked in my component, and so what you'll notice is that a component has three main pieces to it. It has the HTML file, which specifies the structure of my component, like what is actually going to be in my component and on the page when it displays. Second is the style sheet, adding style to my page. And then third is this TypeScript file, which specifies what actually happens, what is the functionality behind my component. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I have my terminal open VS Code. And one thing, if you have seen the intro, the Angular Getting Started tutorial, you will know about the ngserve command. ngserve is essentially going to run the Angular application and allow us to view it in our browser. I'm going to type ngserve here and press enter. And you will see that this might take a second, as it's going to essentially create our web application. And it's going to, now you can see it says application running on port 1562. I can press open browser, and you'll see that now my application is running. So I have two tabs, organizations and events, and I can press on organization, and you'll see I have this welcome to the organizations page text. And I can kind of make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. And I also have a link, which is hard to see because we are on the dark mode version of the CSXL site right now, which says go to events. And if you notice, these two elements, welcome to the organizations page and go to events, are elements that are located in our HTML file. We have our paragraph, welcome to the organizations page, and then we have a link, go to events. For example, if I were to add a header to this, which will be with an h1 tag, and I say organization page, just like that, and then go back to my browser, you will see now a larger header has appeared on my page. So all of these pieces are connected. Now, you'll notice that when I go to my browser, I'm at my localhost 1562 and then /organizations, right? If I press on my events tab, you will see that I jump to this events URL. So how does Angular know, right, given my organizations URL, which page to display, right? Display the organization page or display the events page, which one? And again, as we saw before, that is the job of what we call the Angular App Routing Module. And so I want to take a look at that file. And you'll notice in my directory here, I have this approuting.module.ts file, and I can press on it, and you'll notice that I have all of these items here. First, I have this empty class. We have another decorator called ng module, which is essentially saying that this is an Angular module. You will see ng being used as shorthand for Angular in many different places, both with commands in our terminal and then sometimes in our TypeScript code. So ng module says we're creating an Angular module. Now, what a module is and all of that is something for a different video. But basically, the app routing module, you'll notice, has this, like within my file, I have this list of routes. So for example, I have my organization component route. Here, I have my home component route, and then I have my event component route. And I actually have this piece of code right here, which again, we don't really need to go in too much detail, but basically what this does is it takes my list of routes and then associates the route that we provide with the page that it's supposed to be for. How does it actually do that? Well, if you notice, I have home component.route, organizations.route, and events component.route. And organizations component, as you can see here, is imported from my TypeScript file. If I were to right-click on organizations component and press go to definition, you'll see that organizations component is our TypeScript class for the component that we defined. So what is route right here? Well, if you notice in my class, I have this static property. And remember, when we're dealing with static properties in TypeScript, to actually access them, we have to use the class name dot the name of the static property. And this is in the TypeScript reading, right? So when I'm here, I'm saying organizations component.route, I'm essentially referring to this object that is created right here. And you'll notice that this route object contains a few pieces of information. First, it contains the path that we're supposed to find this page at, right? Or this component at. And so you'll notice that this says organizations, which matches up exactly to /organizations right here in my browser. If I were to change this, for example, to organizations 123 and then save, right? And then you'll see that it recompiles my site and I go back here, right? You'll notice that pressing on the organizations page no longer does anything because my page is no longer found at /organizations. Instead, our component is found at organizations 123. And so then if I type that in, you will see that it shows the correct page. So this path is linked to the URL that we're working with. Title is what shows up in this title toolbar, and how that works is something that we'll be talking about far later, but it's something cool to note. And then we actually store our component in here, which is our organizations component. And so when we pass this information along to our router, right, our router now has access to the component, right, through this component property, the title to display this component for, and then the URL path that this component should appear in, right? And so ultimately, the component is responsible for providing this route information to the app routing module. And in return, the app routing module is going to take the URL that the user types in, and then it's going to provide that provide that component to the user to display. And so in a little bit, I'm going to be showing you a diagram, which will hopefully be helpful in allowing you to see how the app routing module and our components interact. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the HTML and TypeScript files within our component and how they interact with each other. In our organizations component, you'll notice that I have this A tag right here. However, I also have this router link, and this is what's known as a property, okay? And so what we're doing is we're essentially saying that I have this router link property on my A tag, which is going to, whenever we press on it, it's going to activate the router and it's going to move to this /events page, right? So when I'm on my page here and I press on this link, sorry, this link is hard to see, but it's right here. If I press on it, you see that I jump to the events page, right? And so how this works is whenever we're using a Angular property on one of our HTML elements, we use these brackets to denote our property. And then we have these quotes here, which is going to essentially hold TypeScript code for what we want our property to be, right? And so that's why you might notice in this case, we have two quotes, right? We have their double quotes on the outside, and then we have single quotes on the inside. If I ignored these single quotes, right, what you'll notice is that our HTML and VS Code is expecting a TypeScript code to be put inside of these two quotes, right? And so you can almost imagine that what we're putting is TypeScript code, and this would be our TypeScript code that we're passing in. However, because we are trying to pass in a string and not just pure TypeScript code, we need to surround our string with quotation marks. And in TypeScript, you can use both single or double quotes. So we'll use single quotes here. And now this is a TypeScript string that we can pass in to our property, just like that. And so that is how this works and why we don't get an error when we use this single quotes here. And this is what's known as a property binding. So anytime that we're passing a property into an element in our HTML, that is known as a property binding. Now, in contrast, we could have something called an event binding. So for example, let's say I create a button, right? And I'm going to call this button say hi, right? And you'll see that my button now appears on my page. If I go to my organizations page, sorry, I think I'm still at organizations. I need to go to organizations 1, 2, 3. And you can see now I have this say hi button, right? However, clicking this button doesn't do anything. And so what we want to do is we want to connect my button to an actual TypeScript function. And so what I can do is I can now go to my component and I can add a method to my class. For example, I can call this, I'll say public, and let's say I want to call this say hi. So I'll write function. Actually, we don't need to write function because again, this is a class. This isn't the TypeScript reading. I can say hi, just like that. And I'm going to say console log hello world, right? Just like that. And so this is now a function inside of, or a method of my organizations component class. And so now, just like how we have property bindings using our solid brackets, we can use an event binding, which is going to be with our parentheses. And so one of the property bindings is click. Sorry, event binding is click. And so what we're saying is when an event called click occurs, so when we click on the button, we want to run some TypeScript code. And the code we want to run is actually just calling our say hi function. And so I can write say hi with parentheses. And this is valid because remember, what goes inside of our quotes is TypeScript code. And so I'm putting TypeScript code in here. I can press save. And now if I jump over to my live site and I go and open the console, which we'll learn about in a little bit, but the console is whenever we write console log, when we're essentially logging to the console, which is in almost all browsers, both in Chrome and Safari and Edge and all of those browsers, Firefox. And so when I press say hi, you'll notice that now my function ran and hello world has been printed to my console, which is really, really cool. And now the last thing is, what if I want to essentially, let's say I have a property on my organizations component class. For example, let me call this and I'll say, public name equals Chris, just like that. And what if I want to access this variable and put it inside of my text right here? Well, the cool thing is that we can use something called interpolation syntax to do this, which is essentially using two braces, just like that. And then within our braces, again, we can put TypeScript code directly into our HTML. And so for example, I can say name, and it's going to use the name variable that has been, or the name field of my component, and it's going to add it to my text. And so now I can say, for example, hello, the name, comma, welcome to the organizations page. And now if I jump over to my browser, you will see that it says, hello, Chris, welcome to the organizations page, which is really cool. And so this is essentially the relationship between the TypeScript file of a component and the HTML file of the component. And so I highly recommend, going through EX00 and, trying to gain familiarity with how these two files interact, because the interaction between the TypeScript file of a component and the HTML file component is extremely important, and you'll be using it constantly as you are adding new components to your projects. All right, you've made it this far. We're now going to get to the review section of this video. We're essentially going to recap all of the things that we talked about using a diagram. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating this diagram of all of the different tools that we're using in our front-end application, and we're going to be building up this diagram throughout the course. But first, we can start with what we learned today, which is the Angular app routing module and Angular components. And so we're first going to start off with this front-end section. Remember, in the beginning we had front-end and then we had back-end. And we're really focusing on the front-end first. And so this is the front-end section of our diagram. And you can see that we have our app routing module and we have our Angular components, right? Our Angular component is then made up of two things: the HTML, CSS as one section, and then we have our component TypeScript. And you can see that our component TypeScript, for example, through property bindings and through interpolation syntax, as we talked about, it sends data to the UI to display on the HTML. And then the HTML, using event bindings, can call functions that run in the TypeScript. And so that essentially connects both of these two pieces together. Now, of course, we still have this app routing module. And as we talked about, the app routing module and the components are connected. How are they connected? Well, first, remember that our Angular components contain the static route property, which provides information to the router about, what URL should my component appear on, what component should even appear in the first place, what my title is, etc. And so we expose this static route property to our routing module so that we can essentially display the correct component for a given URL. And you can see that interaction here with the arrow going from the component to the app routing module, and then the arrow returning back from the app routing module to the component. And then the last thing here missing in this diagram is the user itself, right? And so the user provides a URL whenever they navigate to a URL, and that is provided to the app routing module. And so then, given the URL, provided from the user, we can display the correct component. And so ultimately, the component is then the active view that the user sees and can interact with. Now, in the next video, I'm going to be adding on to this diagram. We're going to be adding new pieces, new tools within Angular that allow us to essentially work with data and connect data to different components. If you have any questions, I highly recommend coming to our office hours. We host office hours 5 days a week. If you like the video, feel free to like on YouTube and write comments or leave any feedback for us. And I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.